Great games are the result of a lot of tough choices. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 things that never made it into great games. Number 10, The Art of Dishonored, and the art director from Arcane Studios, Sebastian Mitten, revealed a lot of content that never really made it to the game. The game was originally not going to be set in a fictional world. It was actually going to happen in London in 1666. There's one piece of art that is just really beautiful. It's a pencil sketch of London, as would be represented in the game. It is obviously a little bit more dense than real London, I would say. I think they had a pretty keen grasp on where the mechanics were going to take them. It's a beautiful sketch though. There's also the image of a building with a sort of plague cloak over one side of it that was inspired from some images seen during the Black Plague period of, human history. Instead of setting it in a fictional version of our world, setting it in a more fictional world itself is probably a better idea on account it gives you a little more flexibility as to, what the plague actually is. I mean, you get some preconceived notions no matter what, but setting it in our world would basically mean it is the plague, whereas setting it in a fictional world means, plague imagery. And it's almost kind of a shame this building didn't make it into the game because it's really cool looking, particularly the one with the more aged draped cloth. There's also a really cool boat, some weapons, some characters, some situations. In particular, there was what they called lunatics at an asylum, which were kind of zombie-like. They were very interesting looking in my opinion, but I think it probably makes sense they didn't put them in on account. I don't think they wanted the game to be a zombie game, and just the image of that probably would have made it into a zombie game. Especially considering they already had the Weepers, which were kinda zombies, but they weren't so present that the game seemed to be about them. If you had secret zombies, it'd be a zombie game. Number 9, believe it or not, the Resident Evil remake had a lot of cut content, stuff that they were thinking of adding that is actually pretty intriguing. For instance, Mr. X was maybe going to be made a little more military-esque. Fortunately, they ended up going with the Mr. X look. There was a new enemy type considered for jump scares, a sort of child that was, unsettling to say the very least. There were ideas for a more fleshed out alligator sequence, a driving sequence, and even a cable car sequence in the mountains. These would have represented pretty substantial additions to the game, which isn't to say it didn't actually get quite a bit of additional ideas and content. One particularly interesting thing that we've already discussed on gameranx is that they were thinking of doing both fixed camera and first person, and they ended up scrapping it because they thought that the third person over the shoulder gameplay was just too enjoyable. I'm liable to agree with that assessment. Resident Evil 7 is brilliant. First person works incredibly well there, but I think the third person just really lends itself to feeling like Resident Evil 2. It's a different style of game, although some of those elements were reintroduced in Resident Evil 7. I do think it was the right idea to go the way they went. Number 8, Pokémon is a game filled with many, many designs, and as you might expect, there are a large number of Pokémon that didn't make the cut. And some of them were detailed in a book a Pokémon designer by the name of James Turner posted photos of. The book showed us some of Satoshi Tajiri's original Pokémon designs. And what's interesting is that they caused a lot of fan art immediately, particularly this goofy looking crocodile. And I'm gonna go ahead and say that's probably my favorite. There are some people who did the design in ways that just look shockingly like how it would have been drawn in the 90s in the promotional art. And some other people did some more contemporary looking versions of it. But yeah, that's my favorite one. Number 7, just keeping with the Pokemon theme, Pokemon Gold was apparently pretty different when it was debuted at Space World 97, Nintendo's old trade show they put on every year until 2001. And there are actually a lot of various Pokemon designs that turned out differently. Not just the designs themselves, but they actually had some moves that were ultimately deleted, as well as a large amount of dialogue and text being totally different. Now, I can't read Japanese, so I can't tell you how different, but I can tell you that other people have said that it's different. There's also some interesting designs that may have ended up being sort of Eevee-oriented later in the series. Some Pokemon called Rai and Sui. I'm only speculating on the fact that they could have been related to Eevee later on account they remind me of Eevee. But hey, who really knows how all that stuff comes together? Number 6, Bloodborne players dug up a bunch of unused bosses from the game files, and some of them are really cool looking. And also, some of them don't look like they belong in Bloodborne at all. They look like they belong in a Dark Souls game. In fact, some of them ended up in Dark Souls 3, at least to some extent. And there are some interesting patched in versions. And let's just go ahead and say some of it is really, really weird and unsettling. Like, there's one of like a thing that is sitting with its arms crossed, I think, and it scoots on its butt by moving its legs, and it's got like a tied up bag on its head. And I say these things without certainty because I don't know if that's what I'm looking at, but I will say it is weird. There's also a slug princess, and I would recommend checking it out. It's strange. Number 5, early Far Cry 3 concept art showed a lot of stuff that just isn't in the game. A lot of sideways buildings and ships and stuff. Just stuff that got turned on its side somehow. Golf carts, sideways. I'm being a little dismissive just because patterns are funny. Hey, that building's sideways. Hey, that ship is sideways. Hey, that golf cart's sideways. But there are actually quite a few really cool looking locations that just weren't in the game. For instance, there's a pretty nice looking luxury resort that isn't in ruins in the concept art. It's certainly not in the best shape it could be, like if people lived there and it was maintained well, but it's a pretty nice looking place. There's also an amusement park, which, hey, that would have been fun. I would hope it would have been. I mean, amusement parks are meant to be fun, but in a video game, you get to see them in different contexts, and I think that would have been a cool context. There was also a lot of player character designs that didn't make it into the final, but I would say that they're not quite as shocking as looking at the sort of ruined amusement park and thinking, I could have been there. Number 4, and I think this is actually really cool. Skyrim was originally intended to be a little bit more bleak, let's say. You see, when an NPC died in Skyrim back before this changed, there were 2 mechanics that just aren't present now. A, haunting, and B, mourning. Now, I think mourning is the more obvious one. If an NPC that's part of a family dies, the family starts to talk about it. This changes various dialogue, which, by the way, was recorded generic for all NPC voice actors, including children. So all of the lines, including the ones about like husbands and daughters, children say. So it's super weird when the children talk about their children. Not that it isn't overall a bit weird anyway, at least for the more faint of heart. And haunting actually worked in a random manner. If a unique NPC with a family dies, there was a random chance that that NPC would resurrect as a ghost and follow one of their relatives around for the rest of the game. Someone actually found all the files and put out a mod that does it, so you can actually have these features, but keep in mind they're not complete features, but still it's quite interesting. Number 3, God of War actually had 2 hours completely cut from it. It's specifically where Cory Barlog, the game's creator, details what was cut after Atreus recovered from sickness. I'll quote him directly. He goes through a period of time where he starts to realize we're gods, I can do whatever we want. Now, in a real human life, that takes a few years to develop. We didn't have that kind of time, but we did have a lot more time than what's allotted in the game. There was a section that we ended up cutting a good 2 hours out of. So there would have been about 110 minutes maybe of Atreus getting more and more of, as we call it, jerk mode. We had to shift everything back. He starts becoming a jerk right when you get to the boat. He said it's actually the thing about the game he would change. He says it does feel very abrupt, but he believes there's literally nothing they could have done about it, other than simply cut the 2 hours. Also, relax, I'm not going to spoil it. It's new enough that I think if you haven't played it, you should play it. Number 2, The Last of Us had some pretty wild sounding scrapped content. Aside from some acknowledgement of some fairly generic zombie-like monsters, there were also some bald, fanged beasts with fungus on them, but those were cut because they felt they didn't come off as still living infected humans. Remember, The Last of Us isn't a 100% traditional zombie story. In Last of Us, it's caused by a fungus that grows and basically drives the person in a gradually more unhealthy and aggressive direction until they die, and then the fungus releases spores. Now, some interesting ones. There was going to be an infected elephant that was going to chase Joel around during one section of the game, and wow, do I want that to be in Last of Us 2. That is wonderful. There was also going to be a puppy companion for Ellie, which is probably good they didn't include it because they get you attached to that kind of an animal in a zombie game, basically to kill it. It's usually emotional manipulation, just gonna say. And the animal stuff was cut because they didn't want to make animals part of the infection, but hey, maybe the fungus could mutate by the sequel and we could get that elephant, because that elephant sounds great. And finally, number 1, the Half-Life 2 that we played is actually a happier and less bleak version, which says a lot. The planned version that was revealed through an art book and through excavated content from a leaked beta from 2003 showed a world that the Combine just basically totally destroyed. They stripped it bare. The air is so toxic that people had to wear gas masks. A different person was Alex Vance's father, specifically a guy named Captain Vance, who was a turncoat military leader who actually worked for the Combine, which is an interesting choice when they do that to your world. But hey, if you can't beat them, join them, I guess. Can you imagine playing that bleak of a game? Considering how bleak the game actually is, and how much of a different path that seems like, it says a lot about how bleak that vision actually is. But when you consider the events of Half-Life 1, it almost makes sense. It seems very possible, so perhaps the characters, who are definitely not real people, so they can't really feel this, should feel a little more alright about the events of Half-Life 2, I guess? I don't know. What do you think? Leave us a comment, tell us what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now would be a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe, and don't forget to click the notification bell. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.